Hey everybody, this is an entry in Robert J. Alexander's book on the history of international Trotskyism. This entry is about British Trotskyism, and it's titled British Trotskyism Since World War II, International Socialists, IMG, Militants, and Other Groups. Although the Heelyites remained the most important Trotskyist group in Great Britain until the mid-1960s, their relative significance and absolute size declined subsequently. Several other major factions appeared, some as splits with the Healy tendency, others with different origins. At least two of these, the International Socialist and Militant tendency, put forward major points of dissidence with traditional Trotskyism. International Socialist. The, quote, state capitalist, end quote, position of the International Socialists. Among the Trotskyist groups which entered the Labour Party in 1949, what was first known as the Socialist Review Group, headed by Tony Cliff, Palestinian immigrant whose original name was Egal Gluckstein. As we have already noted, it was at that time particularly characterized by its belief that the Soviet Union and other Stalinist-controlled regimes were, quote, state capitalist, end quote, in nature rather than being, quote, worker states, end quote. Tony Cliff first put forth his elaborated, quote, state capitalist, end quote, position in 1948 in The Nature of Stalinist Russia. This volume was reissued with only very slight modifications in subsequent years under different names. In 1974, its 1974 version was entitled State Capitalism in Russia. Tony Cliff argued that the Soviet bureaucracy is a new capitalist ruling class. He said that, quote, the Russian bureaucracy, quote, owning, end quote, as it does the state and controlling the process of accumulation, is the personification of capital in its purest form, ... The fact that the bureaucracy fills the tasks of the capitalist class and by doing so transforms itself into a class makes it the purest personification of this class. Although different from the capitalist class, is at one and the same time the nearest to its historical essence. The Russian bureaucracy, as a partial negation of the traditional capitalist class, is at the same time the truest personification of the historical mission of this class. The most precise name for the Russian society is bureaucratic state capitalism, end quote. Cliff rejected Trotsky's categorization of the Soviet bureaucracy as a, quote, caste, end quote. Quote, it would be wrong to call the Stalinist bureaucracy a caste for the following reasons. While a class is a group of people who have a definite place in the process of production, a caste is a judicial political group. The members of a caste can be members of different classes, or in one class there can be members of different castes. A caste is the outcome of the relative immobility of the economy, a rigid division of labor, and an immobility of the productive forces, whereas the Stalinist bureaucracy was transformed into a ruling class on the crest of the dynamism of the economy, end quote. Cliff also opposed the, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote, description of the Soviet Union and other similar states put forward by Max Shachtman and his followers in the United States and elsewhere. The core of Cliff's critique of the Shachtman position was that, quote, the essence of Shachtman's position is summed up in the statement that the rulers of Russia under Stalin were neither workers nor private owners of capital. What is decisive according to Marxist method in defining the class nature of any society. As the history of all class society is the history of class struggle, it is clear that what does determine the place of any regime in the chain of historical development are these factors which determine the character of the class struggle in it. Now the character, the method, and aims of the class struggle of the oppressed groups are dependent on the nature of the oppressed class itself. The position it has in the process of production, the relation between its members in this process, and its relations to the owners of the means of production. These are not determined by the mode of the appropriation or mode of recruitment of the ruling class, end quote. ... Quote, the big big difference between the mode of appropriation and recruitment of the Russian bureaucrats and that of the bourgeoisie in itself does not at all prove that Russia represents a non-capitalist society, a new class society of bureaucratic collectivism. To prove this, it is necessary to show that the nature of the ruled class, its conditions of life and struggle, is fundamentally different in Russia from what exists even for Shachtman in capitalism." End quote. Cliff claimed that state capitalism, as epitomized by the Stalinist regime, was one stage in the evolution from capitalism to socialism. He argued, quote, "Seeing that state capitalism is the extreme theoretical limit which capitalism can reach, state capitalism is necessarily the furthest away from traditional capitalism. State capitalism is the negation of capitalism on the basis of capitalism itself. Similarly, seeing that a worker state is the lowest stage of the new socialist society, state socialism must necessarily have many features. Seeing that a worker state is the lowest stage of the new socialist society, it must necessarily have many features in common with state capitalism. What distinguishes between them categorically is the fundamental, the essential difference between the capitalist system and the socialist system. The comparison of state capitalism with traditional capitalism on the one hand, and with a workers' state on the other, will show that state capitalism is a transition stage to socialism, this side of the socialist revolution, while a workers' state is a transition stage to socialism, the other side of the socialist revolution." End quote. John Callahan has argued that the position of Tony Cliff and his followers, quote, "contains very little that is specifically Trotskyist. The theory of permanent revolution, for example, is absent, has been trimmed to an allegiance to the, quote, "theory of the impossibility of socialism in one country," end quote, end quote. However, Callahan quotes Duncan Hollis's recollection that, quote, "the founders of the group saw themselves as mainstream Trotskyists, differing only on unimportant questions from the dominant group in the International, but belonging to the same basic tendency," end quote. This is just a side note. The other people that to my knowledge are embracing a state socialist, state capitalist conception of the USSR at this time, such as Castoriadis and Lafore and Raya Dunayevskaya and C.L.R. James. They do not view themselves as mainstream Trotskyists, and in fact step out of the Trotskyist movement altogether. So that's one of the distinctive things about state capitalism, and it's why I feel like, this is just a side note, I feel like a lot of times state capitalist theory is reduced to that of Tony Cliff, and that conception adhered to by the Socialist Workers' Party. One of the articles that I have here is like can't remember what it's called, but like 3 questions or 3 Marxist traditions or something like that by an Alliance for Workers' Liberty member, Thomas Martin. Who's actually, his pieces on Soviet Union I found quite good, are on this channel. Check him out, because he's kind of in a weird thing, because it's to my memory, he embraces a certain state capitalist conception of the USSR within third camp Trotskyism, and one of third camp Trotskyism's tenets, generally speaking, is an embrace of the bureaucratic collectivist conception of the USSR. So I think he has debates within his party about that. Anyway, early years of the International Socialists. Other Trotskyist groups maintain that the Cliff Group's analysis led it to be, quote, neutral, end quote, in the Korean War, when all other Trotskyist elements were supporting the North Koreans. In reply to this, Ian Birchall has written that, quote, in fact, the Korean War was not the issue at the heart of the split. Rather, it was the shamelessly opportunist support for Tito's Yugoslavia by the rest of the Trotskyist movement from 1948 onwards that highlighted the principal differences, end quote. Furthermore, he argued that other Trotskyist groups, by, quote, taking a more or less uncritical attitude to Yugoslavia, North Korea, or other Stalinist states, end quote, were, quote, abandoning the very essence of Trotskyism, namely independence of both Western imperialism and state Stalinism, end quote. Yeah, it kind of seems like the Socialist Workers' Party, which is weird to think of because they're kind of like, in my mind, they're probably like the Socialist Workers' Party in Great Britain, to my mind at least, like based upon being like an isolated, internet tool, like I am, like seems like one of the most prominent, probably seems like one of the most prominent Trotskyist voice in Great Britain, and also like kind of like the most visible on the internet, at least. From an international perspective, me being an American, it's weird to think that they're kind of like on the left of Trotskyism, like even though that other people, I would argue, like are definitely more committed to are a little less inclined to fall into reactionary anti-imperialist positions, such as Alliance for Workers' Liberty. But it's weird to think about them. But they kind of seem like the main dog, but they're kind of like they're less conventionally. It seems like from reading this book, I'm getting the feeling that they're actually pretty far on the left of Trotskyism, which I think does tend to, at least certain tendencies in it, does constitute a certain apologism, a very confused like apologism about it seems like very confused about what they actually think is wrong with, or thought was wrong with the USSR and the Eastern Bloc, or China for that matter. Is it just like a personal vendetta with Stalin? Sometimes it seems like that is just like what is guiding their politics, because they openly embrace Stalinist politics wherever Stalin himself is not involved, or like not embrace, but support more or less. Like if you're like, oh, I don't like this Soviet Union when Stalin's in charge, and then when Stalin's not in charge, it's like, awesome. Or if there's movements led in other parts of the world that are led by authoritarian Stalinist groups who intend to do similar do similar projects to that which characterized Stalinist economic drives. They seem like, oh, that's cool. Or in fact, the worst aspects of Stalinism, which is not the like obviously there's horror about the terror and the purges and stuff, but it's always important to keep in mind how exploitative and how deadly and how non-emancipatory the so-called revolution from above, led by Stalin under the 5-year plans, were for the direct producers in that society. And it seems like, it seems like when, there's a certain degree to which people in Trotskyism kind of like favor Stalinism because, at least he broke, the right opposition and broke the NEP, which the right opposition was defending, and, really collectivized land and industrialized the country. It seems like sometimes I get the feeling when I'm reading Trotsky himself and when I'm reading people who are Trotskyists, that they seem to kind of have like, you know, like their critique of Stalinism and the USSR is kind of like superficial and doesn't really, and that's kind of like Castoriadis's critique, and I think it's completely sound, is that they kind of have like this juridical approach to the Soviet Union on the grounds that like private property is in the means of production is abolished. Therefore, it's socialist at its base. Whereas people like Castoriadis argue that that's a completely juridical conception of what socialism is, and when in fact the relations that permeate the everyday lives of the direct producers are extremely exploitative and top-down, authoritarian, and alienating, just as they are in capitalism. That seems like a way more robust critique, and kind of lends itself to criticizing other political projects calling themselves socialists who seek to implement socialism in such a manner without paying due attention to the everyday life of the direct producers. Yeah. So it makes sense. It doesn't seem like crazy, totally crazy to me when you see like Trotskyists, defending, when you hear like when I'm reading this, it's like, I mean, it's not really like totally crazy or totally seems like a betrayal when certain Trotskyists, like, or most Trotskyists, it seems like Orthodox Trotskyists, more or less defend the USSR and China, just kind of criticized its leadership on certain points and disagree with bureaucratic, dictatorial, ultra-centralist methods that they seem to employ the Trotskyists concurrently seem to employ in the microcosm. Obviously, Trotskyists, it's a big word. It's complicated. There's heterogeneity within people, amongst groups who call themselves Trotskyists. Some people would say certain people aren't Trotskyists at all within Trotskyism. And so there's heterogeneity there. So I don't want to slander just like in broad strokes the entirety of the Trotskyist movement, but it does seem like the minorities, the majority of its critique of the USSR was confused and superficial, as opposed to radical and coherent. And I think the people who moved away from the deformed the degenerated worker state thesis moved into the bureaucratic collectivist and state capitalist thesis were trying to get past that superficiality. Anyway, in September 1950, the Cliff Group, which began to edit Socialist Review, held their, quote, first recorded meeting, end quote. There were just 33 members of the group at the time, of whom 19 were in the Labor League of Youth. The first run of their newspaper was 350 copies. Birchall admitted that, quote, the Socialist Review group was throughout the 50s a purely propaganda group. It was not able to make any meaningful intervention in the class struggle, end quote. Birchall added that, quote, all members were expected to be active in the Labour Party. Before the 1951 general election, a directive was issued stating, quote, it is most necessary that our comrades become known to the working class in their local areas as the most energetic anti-Tory Labour Party workers, end quote, end quote. Birchall also noted that the group was not motivated by, quote, the catastrophic perspective, end quote, of the Heelyites. Quote, there was no expectation of imminent split, no hope of capturing the leadership of a section of the party, end quote. The Cliff Group saw no, quote, impending crisis, end quote. The Cliff Group's, which I guess is the Socialist Review Group, I should say. The Socialist Review Group foresaw no, quote, impending crisis, end quote. The Socialist Review Group's most notable activity during the 1950s was running a member of the group, Jeff Carlson, for the presidency of the Amalgamated Engineering Union. Jeff Carlson received 5,615 votes against 57,125 for the victorious right-wing candidate and 19,799 for the one backed by the Communist Party. International Socialists in the 1960s. In the early 1960s, the Socialist Review Group grew significantly. The Socialist Review Group took an active part in the campaign for nuclear disarmament and launched a new periodical, International Socialism, in 1960. This journal, quote, welcomed the unilateralist victory of Scarborough, but pointed out that the party machine could easily reverse the decision unless it was concretely related to the industrial struggle, end quote. With the launching of the Labour Party's new youth organization, Young Socialists, the Cliff Group, known as the International Socialists, IS, threw themselves into this new field of activity. The International Socialists began to publish a periodical, Young Guard, particularly addressed to the Young Socialists. When the Young Socialists, by then under the control of the Socialist Labour League, withdrew from the Labour Party, the International Socialists members stayed with the newly reorganized Labour Party Young Socialists. Sorry, 1 second. On the Young Socialists, Ian Birchall has commented, quote, for the International Socialists, the experience in the Young Socialists had produced a qualitative advance. The group had grown numerically and by 1964 it had topped the 200 mark. Even more important, the new recruits had played a leading role in what was, albeit briefly, a mass movement. They had rapidly acquired a degree of political sophistication, in some ways an excessive one, bracket, however, end bracket. Although the youth movement was at the center of the arena during the period, the International Socialists never dropped its concern with the industrial struggle. More workers were being recruited to the International Socialists. Though they were being recruited as individuals on the basis of general politics rather than on the basis of an industrial strategy. And most of them were too young to have any decisive influence at their place of work. But for the future, they provided the basis for a new industrial cadre, end quote. Ian Birchall. The International Socialists had its principal industrial base in the ENV engineering firm in West London, where the International Socialists had several of the shop stewards and was in 1966 able to establish its first factory branch. However, shortly afterwards, a dispute at the plant led to the dismissal of most of the International Socialist members working there. Nevertheless, the group was able to have some involvement in strikes of construction workers in London and textile machinery workers in Stockport. During this period of the early 1960s, the International Socialists thought through their ideas more clearly. The International Socialists rejected the notion that they were in fact the leaders of the working class and adopted a more realistic perspective. The International Socialists reasserted the reality of the post-war economic upswing, thus rejecting the, quote, catastrophe perspective, end quote, attributing the economic prosperity to the permanent arms economy. The International Socialists reasserted the notion that the transition to socialism consisted of the reality of the workers in power, hence rejecting the, quote, third worldism, end quote, popular among many other radical groups, including some Trotskyists, and more specifically, rejecting the validity of various types of, quote, African socialism, end quote, Arab socialism, end quote, and similar concepts. That's good. John Callaghan has noted that, quote, in 1965, the International Socialism group withdrew from the Labour Party, believing that the time was ripe and the International Socialist was big enough to work in the growing number of, quote, fragmented and, quote, struggles which were then developing. Having never had illusions about transforming the Labour Party or of splitting the Labour Party, the group made the transition to its new role without internal schism and identified the growing number of strikes, tenants, disputes, and anti-racist campaigns as the arena for independent political work, ... end quote. By the end of 1967, the International Socialist membership had increased to about 400, about double what it had been 4 years before. In that year, the next International Socialist people took an active part in the work of the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign, and largely as a consequence of this activity, quote, International Socialists had grown dramatically in the course of 1968. By the end of the year, end quote. By the end of the year, International Socialists claimed more than 1,000 members, and the International Socialist monthly publication, Labor Worker, had been converted into a weekly, Socialist Worker, quote, with a vastly increased circulation, end quote. Birchall added that, quote, a number of full-time workers had been employed, both for the paper and as regional organizers. The pace of growth had taken the members by surprise, end quote. Ian Birchall. Toward a Workers' Party. The leaders of the International Socialists had come to the conclusion, quote, that it was possible to embark on the process of building an independent revolutionary party, end quote. However, as Birchall noted, quote, a revolutionary party has to meet criteria of size, class composition, program, and capacity to intervene. International Socialists in 1968 could not begin to satisfy the requirement on any count, end quote. The first effort to bring into existence such a revolutionary party was an invitation by International Socialists, quote, to all other revolutionary groups, end quote, for a unification on the basis of, quote, opposition to imperialism, opposition to racism in all its forms, opposition to state control of trade unions, workers' control of society and industry as the only alternative to fascism, end quote. Only one small group, Workers' Fight, responded to this appeal. Merger with it brought only internal bickering between the two groups, and in December 1971 each went its own way. With the failure of its unity proposal, the International Socialists began the work of forming an independent Trotskyist party outside of the Labour Party. The International Socialists' first move was a reorganization of the group's own internal structure. Hitherto, the International Socialists had been loosely organized, and with its national executive consisting of delegates from various branches, the leaders proposed substituting for this, quote, democratic centralism, end quote, an executive elected by a national conference, and the acceptance of the notion that, quote, branches must accept directives from the center unless those branches fundamentally disagree with those directives, in which case they should try to accord with them while demanding an open debate on the matter, end quote. Birchall has noted that these suggestions, quote, caused the greatest internal upheaval International Socialists had ever had. Internal documents proliferated, and at least 5 factions came into existence. It took 2 stormy conferences in September and December 1968 before a new democratic centralist constitution could be agreed, end quote. There continued to be internal tensions largely resulting from the imposition of traditional Leninist democratic centralism on a group which had been, quote, libertarian, end quote, in organizational terms. John Callaghan in his internal struggle, Tony Cliff, and those... Is it with? What do you mean? According to John Callaghan, in this internal struggle, Tony Cliff and those associated with Tony Cliff in the International Socialist leadership relied on purely organizational maneuvering to silence the rebels, ... By changing aspects of the International Socialist internal structure, Cliff preempted the attempt to challenge his policies. The National Committee of 40 was replaced by a Central Committee of 9, which took over its role, while the National Committee itself was relegated to an advisory function. ... The delegate system for conferences was gerrymandered so that districts replaced branches as the representational basis of the organization, ensuring that an estimated oppositional minority of 1/3 to 2/5 of the membership was reduced to 15% of the 1975 conference delegates. End quote. Callaghan has quoted a comment of Duncan Hollis, who had formerly insisted on the priority of the, quote, democratic, end quote, aspect of democratic centralism, as reflecting the post-1975 view of the international socialist leadership concerning the question. Quote, the regime must at all times be as open and flexible as possible, consonant with preserving the revolutionary integrity of the party. The qualification is important, for unfavorable circumstances weaken the ties between the party and the layers of advanced workers, and so increase the problem of, quote, factions, groups, and sects, end quote, which can be an obstacle to the growth of inter-party democracy as Trotsky understood it. ... It is an indispensable function of the leadership, ... to understand when to close, to preserve the core of the organization from disintegration by unfavorable outside pressures, to emphasize centralism, end quote. Duncan Hollis. The tendency toward more orthodox Leninist democratic centralism led to several splits. Callaghan observes, quote, the International Socialist Workers' Party internal battles intensified in the mid-1970s. In 1973, the right fraction was expelled to form the Revolutionary Communist Group. In 1974, Roger Protz was removed as editor of Socialist Workers. Further expulsions in 1975 resulted in the formation of the Workers' League and Workers' Power. At the same time, the International Socialist Workers' Party lost many individuals who had been part of its basic cadre, end quote. Another major problem facing the International Socialists was the fact that the great majority of the International Socialist members were middle-class students, not workers. Ian Birchall commented that, quote, what now had to be begun was a systematic transformation of the organization. Very crudely, it is possible to see three main phases in this process. 1. The membership had to be reoriented toward the industrial working class, ... 2. The composition of the organization had to be changed by recruiting workers into the organization. 3. The workers in the organization had to take over the political leadership, end quote. From International Socialists to Socialist Workers' Party. The upsurge in trade union militancy in the early 1970s, which brought the fall of the Tory government of Edward Heath and the installation of another Labour Party administration, gave the International Socialists their chance. They took a leading role in organizing the rank-and-file organizing committee, which led a series of unofficial strikes in various parts of the country. The International Socialists held several national conferences in the early 1970s. The International Socialists also ran some candidates in elections within important national unions, notably the Transport and General Workers' Union. As a consequence, by 1974, the membership had risen to some 3,000. During this period, the International Socialists launched a number of, quote, rank-and-file, end quote, newspapers. At one point, the International Socialists had as many as 15 of these publications, catering to members of as many unions. By the early 1980s, only 6 of these survived. John Callaghan has sketched the orientation of the International Socialists in this, quote, rank-and-file, end quote, campaign. John Callaghan wrote, quote, "The International Socialist initiative in launching a rank-and-file movement was intended to politicize further these elementary sectional struggles which were tending to overcome the traditional constraints of trade union action anyway, and make them one national movement which would form the basis of a new revolutionary party. The first national rank-and-file conference was called in March 1974 with 50 delegates representing 300 sponsoring bodies. An organizing committee was established consisting entirely of international socialist members. At the time, the revolutionary optimism was high within the international socialists. For the first time since the 1920s, an alternative to parliamentarism had been adumbrated, which threatened both the trade union leadership and the Labour Party. ... The International Socialists tended to make the equation between economic and political militancy, imagining that one followed the other in a straightforward fashion, which would transform International Socialists into a revolutionary party, end quote. John Callaghan. The downturn in trade union militancy during the Wilson-Callaghan Labour government of 1974 to 1979 presented the International Socialists with serious problems. The International Socialist response to the general rightward trend of the labor movement, which was to launch the slogan, quote, "steer left," end quote, which many people within and outside the group regarded as, quote, sectarian, end quote. However, supporters of the, quote, "steer left" line argued that what the steer left line signified was that in the face of the general rightward sentiment among workers, the International Socialists should try to run against this tide. Controversy over this new line resulted in the most serious split that the International Socialists had ever faced. About 150 members of the organization quit or were expelled late in 1975 after a factional fight. Those excluded included Jim Higgins, John Palmer, Granville Williams, and Roger Protz, who had been among the organization's principal leaders during the previous decade. Meanwhile, in the face of declining labor militancy, the International Socialists turned much of its attention to other questions. The International Socialists participated actively in moves to organize the unemployed. They were largely responsible for organizing the Anti-Nazi League, which confronted street marches and demonstrations by various fascist-oriented groups, particularly the National Front. The group also became more involved in struggles for, quote, women's liberation and defense of the rights of homosexuals. In 1982, the Socialist Workers' Party's Central Committee formally abandoned the, quote, rank-and-file, end quote, trade union orientation, which the Central Committee had maintained for about a decade. The International Socialists had clearly defined themselves as a revolutionary group outside of the Labour Party. In January 1975, they reorganized as the Socialist Workers' Party. They also had their first experience in running candidates in political elections. Late in 1976, they contested a by-election in Walsall North, where they got, quote, 1.6% of the poll, more than the Communist Party had gotten that seat in October 1974, and some 25 recruits to the party, end quote. However, quote, by early 1978, it was clear that the electoral strategy had, on balance, been unsuccessful, end quote. The International Socialists had by then run candidates in 8 by-elections, and, quote, in all cases the vote was, as expected, small, ... Moreover, experience showed that it was difficult to maintain those branches built around an election campaign, end quote. The Socialist Workers' Party decided not to run any candidates at all in the 1979 general election. As a consequence of their wide-ranging activities during the late 1970s, the Socialist Workers' Party had largely recovered the ground, at least in terms of membership, which the Socialist Workers' Party had lost as a consequence of the slowdown in industrial activity in the 1975-76 split in the organization. By 1980, The Socialist Workers' Party reported 4,100 members, of whom 36% were manual workers and 32% white-collar workers. Most other Trotskyist groups admitted in the early 1980s that the Socialist Workers' Party had the largest membership of any segment of British Trotskyism. In a pamphlet on the history of the Labour Party, Duncan Hollis summed up the position of the Socialist Workers' Party in the early 1980s. No socialist party worth a brass farthing can be built except by the most active, organized involvement in working class struggles of all kinds and active propaganda to win the workers and others to socialism. That means building a different kind of party, a party rooted in the working classes and unions and in all manner of grassroots activity. It means building a party that does not say, quote, vote for me and we will solve your problems, end quote, but says, quote, you can only solve your problems by fighting for your interests and those of other working people, end quote. A party that exists to coordinate and develop these struggles and direct these struggles toward the seizure of power by the working class, and to hell with the, quote, Constitution, end quote. A party that is internationalist. That is what the Socialist Workers' Party is all about, end quote. The Socialist Workers' Party and the British affiliate of the International Socialist Tendency, the Socialist Workers' Party is the British affiliate of the International Socialist Tendency in the World Trotskyist Movement. The Militant Tendency. Origins of the militant group. By the early 1980s, the Socialist Workers' Party was numerically the largest Trotskyist group in Great Britain. The militant tendency was certainly the most influential element in British Trotskyism. It was the lineal descendant of the segment of the membership of the post-war Revolutionary Communist Party under the leadership of Ted Grant, which had gone into the Labour Party in 1949. However, unlike most of the other, quote, entrist, end quote, Trotskyist groups, it had persisted in its attempt to penetrate the Labour Party, and had even concluded that that was the only strategy appropriate to Trotskyism in a country such as Great Britain. The Grant group had remained very small, as was true of most of the British Trotskyist factions during the 1950s. For a short period, they had relations with Michel Pablo's International faction after the 1953 split in the Fourth International. This came about as a result of the placing in Tribune of an advertisement for a mimeographed magazine, Fourth International, being edited by a group of Cypriot supporters of Pablo in London. Sam Bornstein and Al Richardson have explained what happened. Quote, Sam Bornstein, at that time not connected with any of the groups, replied to the advertisement and was contacted by Jacques Prévert, whom he met with Jean Fairhead. Fairhead and Bornstein agreed to take over the day-to-day running of the duplicated Fourth International. Bornstein contacted Grant's group in London and arranged a meeting with them and Pablo. It was this loose amalgam of Grant's group, the Cypriots, some Ceylonese students, and a small group of West Indians who had just broken with Healy that agreed to work together with Bornstein as managing editor of Fourth International, later Workers' International Review. End quote. The Cypriot and Ceylonese elements, together with some British Trotskyists from the left fraction of the Revolutionary Socialist League of the 1940s, had constituted the Committee for the Regroupment of the British section of the Fourth International. The faction headed by Ted Grant was the International Socialist Group. Then they joined forces, setting up a new Revolutionary Socialist League. At the 1975 Congress of the Pabloite version of the Fourth International, the Revolutionary Socialist League was officially recognized as the British section of that group. The new Revolutionary Socialist League published two periodicals for a while, Socialist Fight and Workers' International Review. The Revolutionary Socialist League soon split, some of those who broke away forming the predecessor of the International Marxist Group. The Grant Group got its first chance for expansion with the re-establishment of a Labour Party youth group, Young Socialists, in 1960. Their members were very active in the organization, and when the Heelyites took most of the Young Socialists out of the Labour Party in 1964, the Grant Group remained with the Labour Party in the new Labour Party Young Socialists. They fought there to have the Labour Party leadership reduce the controls it exercised over the youth group. Meanwhile, the Grant Group had launched a monthly newspaper, Militant. Henceforth, they were known among themselves and in the general public as the Militant Tendency. Expansion of the Militant Tendency. The Militant Tendency was able to take considerable advantage of the increasing discontent which arose within the Labour Party during the years of the Labour government of Harold Wilson from 1964 to 1970. The Militant Tendency were active in the student upsurge of 1968 to 69, concentrating their work particularly on the Labour Party student organization, the National Association of Labour Students, and on the short-lived Revolutionary Socialist Youth Federation. They did not concentrate the bulk of their propaganda and organizational activities on the students during this period, as did some of the other radical groups. They argued that the students had no real social base and that although they might make an important revolutionary contribution, they could only do so as part of a movement basically made up of and led by workers. In 1972, the Militant Tendency won control of the Labour Party Young Socialists, partly as a result of the fact that the Labour Party did not take the Militant Tendency very seriously at that time, being more worried about the International Marxist Group and the Heelyites. The Labour Party officialdom did very little to try to prevent militant control of the party's youth group. Later, the militants did encounter harassment and obstructionism, such as the closing down of some local Labour Party Young Socialist groups, rejection of credentials of militants at LPYS conventions, or those LPYS representatives at Labour Party annual conferences. In 1981, for instance, between 20 and 30 delegates were thus denied seats at the Labour Party annual conference. The militants in control of The militants in control of Labour Party Young Socialists went out of their way to try to avoid a direct confrontation with the Labour Party leadership. Thus, they accepted the practice that drafts of policy documents submitted to Labour Party Young Socialists conferences. Where am I? The militants in control of the Labour Party Young Socialists went out of their way to try to avoid direct confrontation with the Labour Party leadership. Thus, they accepted the practice that drafts of policy documents submitted to Labour Party Young Socialists conferences should be drawn up by the research department of the Labour Party rather than Labour Party Young Socialist leaders. The purpose of the Militant Tendency was not to get thrown out of the Labour Party, but rather to win over as many people within that party to their point of view as possible. The degree of hegemony of the Militant Tendency over the Labour Party Young Socialists was shown in the Labour Party Young Socialists 1979 conference, where its only opponents were two other small Trotskyist factions, Workers' Action and Clause 4, and the militant slate for the new executive committee received 200 votes against 20 votes each for the opposing groups. As a consequence of its control of the Labour Party Young Socialists, the Militant Tendency from 1972 on had a member of the National Executive Committee of the Labour Party. The Militant Tendency was also able to make considerable headway in the local constituency organizations of the Labour Party. In part, this success was attributable to the decline of those same constituency organizations during the late 1960s and early 1970s. It was characteristic for only a handful of the registered Labour Party members in any constituency group to attend its meetings. As a consequence of their penetration of the local Labour Party groups, the Militant Tendency had appreciable representation at Labour Party annual conferences. For instance, The militant tendency claimed that at the 1975 conference, 3/4 of the constituency Labour Party delegates voted for resolutions which were introduced by the militant tendency, and that in 1976 1/3 of all the speeches made were delivered by members of the militant group. The militant tendency was also successful in getting a number of its members adopted as Labour Party parliamentary candidates. In 1982, it was reported that there were at least 7 such cases. Militant influence in the Liverpool Labour Party gained particular public attention. Labour won control of the Liverpool City Council in 1983 after 11 years of a Liberal Party administration. Of the 51 Labour Party council members, the New York Times reported that 15 belonged to the militant tendency. The Times reporter John Nordheimer reported that although the militant tendency, quote, has been largely disavowed by the national labor leaders, the faction's influence here has been strengthened by less ideological members of the local party who agree that only a radical course of action can bring hope to the city, end quote. During the 1970s and early 1980s, the militant tendency was able to win some influence in the trade union movement. At the 1982 conference of the Civil and Public Service Association, a member of the militant tendency was elected president and several others were elected to its executive. The militant tendency also had control of the Bakers Union, which the militant tendency was largely responsible for organizing. The militant tendency in 1982 had members on the national executives of the Transport and General Workers Union, the Fire Brigades Union, the National Local Government Workers Union. In the National Union of Public Employees, they had 4 or 5 appointed local officials in areas where they had a substantial membership base. They held many offices in locals of various unions. The militants were reportedly quite frank about their affiliation when running for union office. In unions where that was the custom, they usually drew up election manifestos which made it clear that their candidates were members of the militant tendency. By mid-1982, the militant tendency people claimed to be the main element in the broad left within and outside the Labour Party. The militant tendency had been able to capitalize on the drastic decline of and confusion within the Communist Party. For example, whereas a decade earlier the Communists had been the principal left-wing force within the powerful Amalgamated Engineering Union, by the early 1980s, the militant tendency claimed to hold that position. By mid-1982, the militant tendency reported having been between 4,000 and 5,000 members. They claimed that their paper, Militant, had a paid circulation of some 30,000 copies, more than the Tribune or the Communist Party's daily newspaper, Morning Star. At the time of the Malvinas Falkland Islands War in April-May 1982, the militant tendency issued the call, quote, no support for junta, no support for junta, no support for Tories, end quote. An editorial in the group's newsletter paper argued that Argentine President Galtieri had launched the invasion of the islands to divert popular attention from the failures of his regime. I believe that is the case. To my understanding of the role of the Falklands War in the invasion of the Falkland Islands in the Argentine political history. But anyway. It argued that, quote, given the class basis of the Argentine regime and the effect of the invasion on the islanders themselves, there is no hesitation in condemning the invasion that took place on April 2nd, end quote, but also declared itself opposed to the, quote, jingoism and chauvinism of the Tory press and the Thatcher government in Britain, end quote, and argued that, quote, Labour must demand a general election in order that a Labour government can support and encourage workers' opposition in Argentina, end quote. I heard someone one time refer to the Falklands War as 2 bald men arguing over a comb, which I thought was clever. Okay. Labor assaults on the militant tendency. In mid-1982, an effort was made by the National Committee of the Labour Party to carry out a purge of members of the militant tendency. The move to have the NEC take such action had begun as early as 1977, when the second-ranking member of the Labour Party staff began producing reports on the militant tendency for the National Executive. Finally, in June 1982, the National Executive Committee voted 16-10 to set up a, quote, register of approved organizations, end quote, within the party, at the same time deciding that the militant tendency could not qualify as such an organization. The militant group was given 3 months to, quote, list its aims, officers, employees, membership, and accounts, end quote. Michael Foot, then leader of the Labour Party, approved the measure, calling the militant tendency a, quote, secret conspiracy, end quote, which, quote, has to be eliminated, end quote. This position contrasted sharply with his opposition in previous decades to efforts to purge the Trotskyists from the Labour Party. A number of unions quickly went on record against this measure, which had to be approved by the annual conference of the party. So did a large number of constituency Labour parties. A number of other groups operating within the Labour Party also announced that they would refuse to register as, quote, approved organizations, end quote. These included Campaign for Labour Democracy, Labour Coordinating Committee, Labour Committee on Ireland, Labour Abortion Rights Campaign, and Socialist Organiser, the last also a Trotskyist group. Although no blanket condemnation of the militant tendency was adopted at the time, it was reported that between 1983 and 1985, over 30 supporters of the militant tendency had been individually expelled from the Labour Party. At the 1985 annual conference, Labour Party leader Neil Kinnock denounced the, quote, implausible resolutions, ... pickled into rigid dogma, end quote, which the militant delegates had introduced at the conference. Neil Kinnock also labeled the militant tendency, quote, a maggot in the body of the Labour Party, end quote. After a few weeks, the National Executive Committee of the Labour Party launched a, quote, investigation, end quote, of the Liverpool section of the party and of the city government it controlled, and which had particularly strongly resisted the Thatcher government's attempts to cut back on its social welfare programs, alleging, quote, corruption, misuse of public funds, providing jobs for supporters, and intimidation, end quote. The ideological positions of the militant tendency. The ideological orientation of the militant tendency was consistent for over more than a quarter of a century. It centered on what John Callaghan has described as, quote, economism, end quote. Ted Grant and his supporters argued that world capitalism in general and British capitalism in particular were undergoing a long-run decline due to the falling rate of profit. Sooner or later, this would result in a massive onslaught by the capitalist class and the capitalist class's government on the living standards of the British working class. Although the militant tendency leaders' description of the details of this process varied from time to time and was not infrequently contradictory, the basic nature of the British economic crisis continued to be the centerpiece of the doctrine of the militant tendency. The group's political orientation was determined by this view of Britain's prospects. John Callaghan has noted that, quote, militants' general perspectives ... have stayed remarkably constant since the late 1960s. In 1968, Ted Grant envisaged that a new economic crisis would lead to a leftward swing in the unions and the Labour Party, and that the parliamentary wing of social democracy would split, with the right wing joining the Tories, end quote. It was in the expectation of that eventuality, of course, that the militant tendency was so steadfast in its continuing policy of entrism in the Labour Party. Because of its concentration on working within the unions and the Labour Party, the militant tendency did not get involved in, quote, peripheral, end quote, issues. Callaghan has noted that, quote, the militant tendency believes that the anti-Nazi League, the women's movement, and the campaign for nuclear disarmament obstruct rather than aid the socialist cause, end quote. The militant tendency maintained an orthodox Trotskyist position on the question of the nature of the Soviet Union, that the Soviet Union and the other Stalinist regimes were, quote, degenerated workers' states, end quote. However, on one other issue, the militant tendency disagreed with the traditional Trotskyism. As a general principle, it opposed the establishment of separate revolutionary socialist parties, favoring instead that Trotskyists should work within traditional workers' parties. The militant tendency opposed the ultimate establishment of a one-party state in view of what had happened in the Soviet Union. The militant tendency expressed confidence that once all means of production and distribution were nationalized, there would be no danger of parties such as the Tories ever being able to convince the workers that capitalism should be reestablished. The militant tendency favored the ultimate nationalization of all the press, with access to the press being granted in proportion to the support any particular party had among the voters. In the international field, the militant tendency maintained relations with other avowed Trotskyist groups following a, quote, deep interest, end quote, policy. John Callahan reported the founding in 1975 of a, quote, interest international, end quote, at a conference attended by 48 people from Britain, Ireland, Sweden, and Germany. The militant tendency also maintained relations with left-wing elements in the youth groups of various European social democratic parties. Despite their divergences from traditional Trotskyist positions, the militant tendency continued to regard themselves as Trotskyists. Their book and magazine sales service sold Trotsky's works extensively. Their publications continue to cite Trotsky with certain frequency. The militant tendency regarded the other British Trotskyist groups as, quote, sects, end quote. Thus Ted Grant wrote in one pamphlet that, quote, the plague of small sects, largely as a result of splits in other sects, has developed as a consequence of the failure of the larger sects like the IMG, SWP, and WRP to build and maintain mass revolutionary organizations according to their theories and ideas. The sects all spread disillusion, cynicism, and skepticism. As Marxism becomes an important force in the working class and gains support in the working class, generally the sects can do less damage than they have done in the past, end quote. Internal organization of the militant tendency. Because of its deep interest policy and its desire to avoid getting expelled from the Labour Party, the militant group inevitably had to function on a somewhat conspiratorial basis. John Callahan has noted that, quote, the militants' mode of operation is a concomitant of its, quote, unofficial, end quote, quasi-clandestine status. Contacts are made via newspaper sales. Only when the contact proves himself reliable is he introduced to the militant organization proper, end quote. Callahan adds that, quote, as with other far-left organizations, the militant group's leadership echelon is remarkably stable. These figures, Ted Grant, Peter Taft, Lynn Walsh, Keith Dickinson, Claire Doyle, Roger Silverman, Brian Ingham, etc., have between 13 and 27 years' activity as Trotskyists in the Labour Party. These are the names which appear in the list of 25 shareholders in Workers' International Review Publications Limited, the owner of Militant Publications, end quote. However, Callahan noted that, quote, it is unclear what the contribution of the ordinary supporter can be, There is no evidence of discussion and debate or of the involvement of the rank and file. The national meetings which Militant does hold appear to be organized more like rallies than conferences, with the audience playing a relatively passive role, end quote. Under these circumstances, the militant tendency has been almost unique among the Trotskyist groups in having had few, if any, internal controversies or splits. Callahan has noted that, quote, he, quote, found no written evidence whatever of such fissures in the group's long history, end quote. The International Marxist Group Socialist League. Origins and early activity. The remote origins of the International Marxist Group were to be found in a number of members of the Nottingham and Midlands branch of the Communist Party, notably Ken Coates and Pat Jordan, who were expelled from the Communist Party of Great Britain over the Soviet invasion of Hungary in 1956. After short association with Jerry Healy's Socialist Labor League, they joined the Revolutionary Socialist League of Ted Grant. However, in 1961, these people, described by Bornstein and Richardson as, quote, Pablo and Mandel loyalists, end quote, withdrew from the Revolutionary Socialist League to establish what they called the International Group. They returned to the Revolutionary Socialist League once again in 1964 on the urging of the United Secretariat of the Fourth International. Within the Revolutionary Socialist League, the former International Group members began to publish a periodical, The Week. This time, their association with Ted Grant's group lasted for only about a year when they withdrew to establish the International Marxist Group. At the 1965 Congress of the United Secretariat, the International Marxist Group was jointly recognized with the Revolutionary Socialist League as a sympathizing organization of the United Secretariat Executive Committee. When the Revolutionary Socialist League, which until then had the status of the British section of the United Secretariat, took this move as an affront and broke off all relations with the United Secretariat. That left the International Marxist Group as the only British affiliate of the United Secretariat. Tariq Ali wrote about the early years of the IMG. That, quote, the International Marxist Group was formally constituted in 1966. The International Marxist Group's early life was dominated by the Labour Party, and the Labour Party's strategy premised on the emergence of a left current inside the Labour Party, which would raise the banners of revolt against the Wilson clique. This never took place despite the vicious and reactionary policies of the Wilson administration, end quote. The International Marxist Group received its first impetus for rapid growth in the student upsurge of the 1967-68 in the campaign against the Vietnam War. It was largely responsible for organizing the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign. That movement reached its high point in a demonstration on October 27, 1968, in which 100,000 people participated. Two leaders of the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign, Tariq Ali and Ernest Tate, presented a letter to the 10 Downing Street addressed to Prime Minister Harold Wilson, which said, quote, Dear Harold, in the name of 75,000 workers and students, we demand that you stop supporting American imperialism and start supporting the NLF in Vietnam, end quote. John Callahan has noted that at least two things characterize the role of the International Marxist Group in the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign. On the one hand, it fought successfully to keep it a, quote, one-issue, end quote, campaign. On the other, it insisted on raising as the campaign's major slogan, quote, victory for the National Liberation Front, end quote. Subsequently, the International Marxist Group was to insist on an equally radical stance with regard to the situation in Northern Ireland. It adopted the slogan, quote, victory for the Irish Republican Army, end quote, and refused to condemn or even to criticize in any way the terrorist activities of the Irish Republican Army. The success of the International Marxist Group in its student and anti-war activities resulted in a substantial increase in membership. Reporting to the IMG January 1969 conference, International Secretary Pat Jordan said that the number of members had doubled within the previous year. Without any doubt, most of the new recruits were young middle-class people with little base in the trade union movement or the Labour Party. This fact was underlined by the decisions and attitudes of that same January 1969 conference. According to Intercontinental Press, quote, The conference discussed the perspectives of the new student upsurge and the current situation in the Labour Party and the trade unions. The Labour parliamentary left was scored for its complete failure to project a militant alternative to the right-wing programs of the Wilson leadership. The delegates felt that this made the independent work of the International Marxist Group more necessary than ever. This was seen, however, as complementary to oppositional work inside the Labour Party. End quote. The International Marxist Group finally gave up entrism into the Labour Party, at least for the time being, late in 1969. In the following years, it established a youth group, the Spartacus League. Titular leadership of the International Marxist Group was meanwhile largely assumed by Tariq Ali, who had joined in early 1968. As a side note, the Tariq Ali, to my understanding, is very much in Great Britain the representative of Orthodox Trotskyism, whereas the Socialist Workers' Party, with its conception of state capitalist conception of the USSR, breaks from Orthodox Trotskyism. So in the terms of the mainstream, it seems like Tariq Ali is a little bit more on the conservative end of Trotskyism. Tariq Ali was successively editor of periodicals sympathetic to or controlled by the group First Black Dwarf, then Red Mole, and finally in 1977 Socialist Challenge. I think he was also a big editor on of the New Left Review, and I think he continues to be important in Verso, which is like the successor of New Left Review. At the time of the 1970 election, which resulted in the defeat of the Labour government, there was a debate in the International Marxist Group as to whether or not it should support the Labour Party's candidates. Pat Jordan wrote an official statement in Red Mole in reply to an earlier article by Robin Blackburn urging abstention, that the International Marxist Group supported Labour, but that, quote, our role should be to raise the level of consciousness, to prepare people for the coming struggles, and to fight any illusion that the election result will solve any problems, end quote. Jordan summed up the then current attitude of the International Marxist Group thus, quote, the Labour Party has been, quote, buried. I don't know why I say like that. Buried? I don't know, buried. It's weird. Feels like I still want to say buried. Anyway, quote, the Labour Party has buried many times and yet still exist as an obstacle in the building of a revolutionary party. It won't bleed to death and executioner is needed. Only the working class under revolutionary leadership can destroy the Frankenstein's monster it created. This article is a contribution to the discussion the left is having as to just how to set about doing that, end quote. In June 1972, the majority political resolution adopted by the IMG conference by a vote of 86-4, 19 against 23 abstentions, proclaimed that, quote, our main theoretical task was an analysis of the Labour Party and the struggle against economism, end quote. It did not indicate clearly whether this was to be done from within the Labour Party or from outside. At another point, the resolution stated that, quote, the task of breaking the working class from social democratic politics is not a question of exposing the nature of the leadership of the Labour Party, but of revealing the bankruptcy of the entire social democratic method of struggle, end quote. In fact, the International Marxist Group had gained little ground either in the Labour Party or the trade unions. The only entry of any significance had been among the organized workers the IMG had among the organized workers had been a campaign around the concept of, quote, workers' control, end quote, in the middle 1960s, in which Ken Coates had been particularly active. After Coates split away from the International Marxist Group, the International Marxist Group, quote, lost its influence over the militants. It had done much to mobilize in the Workers' Control Conferences, and since 1968, when the conferences were formalized at the Institute for Workers' Control, the International Marxist Group has played no part in that movement. End quote. In 1977 to 78, the International Marxist Group carried on a campaign to try to unify the various Trotskyist groups, except the militant tendency. It particularly sought to make overtures to the Socialist Workers' Party. However, there proved to be insufficient basis of agreement for bringing together the various Trotskyist factions. Only two small groups, Big Flame and the Marxist Workers' Group, agreed to engage in some joint political activities with the International Marxist Group. By the time of its 1978 conference, the International Marxist Group had somewhat modified its anti-labor policy position. The political resolution adopted at that time called for, quote, the building of a left-wing class struggle in the mass organizations. This above all means building oppositions within the trade unions, ... Where appropriate, it also involves the work of supporters of our politics inside the Labor Party, end quote. However, the same resolution noted that work within the Labor Party, quote, has a lower priority, end quote, than that in, quote, the trade unions, the anti-racist and anti-fascist struggle, the women's movement, the students, and taking steps towards the creation of a youth organization, end quote. It was reported that 18% of the delegates were industrial workers, 56% were white-collar workers, and 79% of the delegates were trade unionists, compared with 55% of the general membership of the International Marxist Group. In the 1979 general election, the International Marxist Group organized what the International Marxist Group called the, quote, Socialist Unity, end quote, campaign. The Socialist Unity campaign put up 10 candidates who, quote, everywhere garnered only a handful of votes, end quote. A supporter of working exclusively within the Labor Party claimed that, quote, because their political ideas came packaged with a central proposal to break Labor movement ranks and vote for an obviously hopeless candidate, it is unlikely that even their propaganda work did much good, ... end quote. In general, the International Marxist Group tended to take positions similar to those of the Socialist Workers' Party of the United States on such issues as race relations. Thus, it supported the idea of a separate black movement in Britain, being the only Trotskyist group in the country having that position. In the controversy within the United Secretariat of the Fourth International in the 1970s over the issue of support of guerrilla warfare, the International Marxist Group sided with the European groups against the position of the Socialist Workers' Party of the United States. As a consequence, a split developed in 1975 to 76 with the formation of the League of Socialist Action, which supported the line of the American Socialist Workers' Party. The League dissolved in 1981 with the end of that controversy, and its members returned to the International Marxist Group. It's important to note that as the American Socialist Workers' Party, if you're not familiar with this reference, the American Socialist Workers' Party, over the course of, from the beginning of the 1960s onward, increasingly became interested in, started to move away from conventional Trotskyism, which put a, like Marxism in general, put a primary focus on the collective action of mass working class, and then instead started to have way more sympathy with guerrilla warfare tactics led by small, petty bourgeois intellectuals and with peasant guerrilla fighters. Became way more sympathetic to that view, and it seems like their entire project was just defending what they viewed as the progressive conquests of the Cuban Revolution. So their Trotskyism became depending on how you look at it, enhanced or diluted by Castroism. So that's the context of that becoming similar to the United States in that position. Another small split in the International Marxist Group occurred as a result of the United Secretariat Executive Committee's controversy of the 1970s, a little group which sympathized with the third tendency in the United Secretariat, which had appeared at the 10th World Congress in 1974, broke away sometime later to form the International Communist League. The International Communist League associated with the Necessary International Initiative, NII, a kind of, quote, opposition, end quote, outside of the United Secretariat for some time thereafter. We have no indication of how long the International Communist League continued to exist. With the development of a further factional struggle within the United Secretariat as a result of the United States Socialist Workers' Party's move away from Trotskyism in the early 1980s, the majority of the International Marxist Group, SL, where's the SL come from? What's the SL mean? Come on, you son of a gun. I don't know. I'll just say SL. Oh, you bastard. One second, fucking goddamn computer farted out on me. Let's see if I can get back to where I was. Not feeling hopeful. Okay, back to the text. Alright, back to where I was. With the development of a further factional struggle within the United Secretariat as a result of the U.S. Socialist Workers' Party's move away from Trotskyism in the early 1980s, the majority of the International Marxist Group SL sided with the majority of the United Secretariat. There was a minority in the British group which supported the position of the Barron's leadership in the United States Socialist Workers' Party. Early in 1983, the International Marxist Group decided to return to an entryist policy and have its members join the Labour Party and concentrate on work within the Labour Party. The formal announcement of this decision was made in the group's newspaper Socialist Challenge on February 25, 1983. Under the heading, quote, final issue, end quote, it wrote that, quote, with next week's issue, number 283, Socialist Challenge is ceasing publication. But don't worry. Socialist Challenge supporters have decided to turn all their energies towards supporting a new paper being launched in the Labour Party and trade unions called Socialist Action. Many of the writers who now contribute to Socialist Challenge will be writing for the new paper, end quote. The first issue of Socialist Action carried greetings from, among others, Tony Benn, leader of the Labour Party, Ken Livingstone, the leader of the Greater London Council, and eventually, doesn't say he's here, but he's eventually the mayor of London, several Labour left members of Parliament, including longtime Labour left leader Ernie Roberts. It also announced the setting up of, quote, Socialists for a Labour Victory, end quote, within which the ex-International Marxist Group people were working. Back within the Labour Party, the International Marxist Group changed its name to Socialist League. Charles van Gelderen, a leader of the group, summarized their perspectives in deciding once more to try to penetrate the Labour Party. Quote, Briefly, it was decided to make a turn toward the Labour Party, where a left current was developing, initially associated with Tony Benn, but it has now gone beyond Tony Benn, or rather, he has lagged behind the developments. Although we have retained the perspective of a turn to industry in the present situation with Britain in industrial decline, there is no immediate perspective of fruitful work in that field. ... End quote. A pamphlet published by Socialist Action soon sketched the group, after the group returned to the Labour Party, sketched its perspective for work within the Labour Party. Quote, to carry through the fight for a revolutionary workers' government, it is necessary to construct a mass revolutionary workers' party. The Labour Party has always been dominated by a bureaucracy, even during its most left-wing periods. ... The restructuring of the labor movement and the emergence of a mass anti-capitalist party will therefore most certainly take the route of a split in the Labour Party. Such a split will be the political responsibility of the right-wing leaders. Whether socialists will win a majority in the Labour Party cannot be predicted in advance, but the battle for a socialist program must be waged inside the mass organizations of the working class. ... End quote. The nature of the international Marxist group SL. John Callaghan has noted two characteristics of the International Marxist Group SL as an organization. These were the very high degree of activity it required of its members and its democratic internal life. Speaking of the period of the 1970s, Callaghan noted that, quote, the International Marxist Group activists became preoccupied with campaigns on Ireland, racism, feminism, Vietnam, the organization of school students, etc., aimed at immigrants, women, youth, and the unemployed. By 1971, the International Marxist Group had accumulated over 30 front organizations, approximately one for every 11 members of the organization. End quote. He noted 16 different kinds of activity that the International Marxist Group member would be expected to engage in, both within the International Marxist Group and in its various peripheral groups. He noted that, quote, such activism leaves little time for anything else, end quote. In commenting on the internal organization of the International Marxist Group, Callaghan has noted that, quote, if the IMG was in any way sounder and more stable than the rest of the far left, it was in respect of the organization's internal regime, for throughout the International Marxist Group's existence, the International Marxist Group has avoided the kind of internal disruption and authoritarianism which we have encountered elsewhere on the Trotskyist left. From the International Marxist Group's origins in the mid-1960s to the end of the 70s, no factions were expelled from the International Marxist Group, end quote. Callaghan added concerning the rights of individual International Marxist Group leaders within the organization that, quote, clearly these formal rights are extensive. Furthermore, the International Marxist Group's political practice, which is relatively free from instances of authoritarianism, shows that these rights are real, that in other words, the organization's political culture is genuinely democratic, end quote. By the mid-1980s, the International Marxist Group SL remained predominantly middle class in social composition. Its influence in the trade union movement was minimal in absolute terms, as well as in comparison with some of the other British Trotskyist groups. An unfriendly source has observed that, quote, at present there are happily ensconced, the International Marxist Group are happily ensconced in the Labour Party, where the International Marxist Group continue their battle against their old boogies, workerism and economism. ... End quote. What was I going to say? I feel like I was going to say something. Yeah, this was written in 1991. So as of 1991. The Thornick Group. The five significant The fifth significant Trotskyist element in Great Britain by the early 1980s was that associated with the newspaper Socialist Organizer. It was sometimes referred to as the Thornet Group, after its best-known trade union figure, Alan Thornet. The remote origins of this faction go back to a split in the Socialist Labour League in 1963 led by Sean Matgamna. Matgamna had started his political career in the Young Communist League, leaving the Young Communist League to join the Socialist Labour League. Immediately after quitting the Socialist Labour League, Matgamna and his followers first joined the militant group, quote, and left after writing an 85-page document criticizing them, end quote. The Matgamna group developed close relations with the Irish Workers' Group, a seedbed of various radical elements in Ireland. After spending some time in the International Socialists, the Matgamna group was expelled from the International Socialists in 1971 and established Workers' Fight. In 1975, Workers' Fight merged with Workers' Power, another element recently expelled from the International Socialists, to form the International Communist League. A year later, most of the former members of Workers' Power withdrew again to reform Workers' Power, charging the Matgamna group with being, quote, centrist and, quote, seasoned opportunists, end quote. It was the International Communist League which was principally responsible for launching a new periodical and group late in 1978. According to M. North, one of the leaders of the Socialist Organizer group, quote, the paper, Socialist Organizer, first appeared in late 1978. The title began as The Paper of the Socialist Campaign for a Labor Victory. Although Trotskyists were active in organizing and building the Socialist Campaign for Labor Victory, the Socialist Campaign for Labor Victory was not a purely Trotskyist campaign, as the Socialist Campaign for Labor Victory set out to organize all the, quote, serious, end quote, left within the Labor Party, end quote. The International Communist League were apparently impressed by the progress of the left within the Labor Party after the party's 1979 defeat, and felt that the way was opened for a new kind of campaign within the Labor Party. In one of its last issues, the International Communist League periodical Workers' Action had spelled this out, saying that changes of the Labor Party structure made possible, quote, transformations of the Labor Party into a real instrument of the working class, end quote. Workers' Action added that the 1979 annual conference of the party, quote, demonstrates that transforming the political wing of the labor movement is a possibility, and thus that it is possible to raise the transitional demand for a workers' government in Britain, where in the initial stages such a government would inevitably have the Labour Party as its major or only component, end quote. Sean Matgamna has explained the strategy of the Socialist Organizer group. Matgamna noted that it was established, quote, at a national conference in July 1978 of 200 activists from a broad spectrum of the Labour Party and trade union left, end quote, and that, quote, our immediate goal was to organize a parallel election campaign within the official Labour campaign. Leaflets on Ireland, racism, women, and the unions explain the political positions in our Where We Stand. As well as warning against the danger of the return of the Tories, our campaign criticized the Labour government and argued for a commitment to fight for socialist organizers' politics, whoever won the election, end quote. Matgamna concluded that, quote, we tried to give socialists who had good reason to be disgusted with the Wilson-Callahan-Healy government a perspective of struggle against them within the vitally necessary effort to mobilize the labor movement to keep the ultra-reactionary Tories out, end quote. Just a side note, Sean Macomna went on to be a major, or the leading figure in the Alliance for Workers' Liberty, and Macomna also I believe he's not unique, obviously not unique as a whole, but one of the main people within British Trotskyism who kind of later, after some like theoretical and I guess like historical investigation, began to adopt the bureaucratic collectivist conception of the USSR and third campism in general. The Socialist Organizer Group succeeded in getting the support of a number of non-Trotskyist left-wing laborites. Thus, in its immediate post-election issues, Socialist Organizer had short articles by successful Labour candidates Ernie Roberts, Ron Leighton, and Stuart Holland, as well as by several defeated nominees, including Ted Knight and Ken Livingstone, who 2 years later was to be elected head of the Greater London Metropolitan Council. M. North wrote that, quote, after the victory of the Conservative Party in the 1979 elections, the work of the SCLV, Socialist Campaign for Labour Victory, came to an end, but the Socialist Organizer Group continued around the country. This system has been maintained since that time. ... The aim of the alliance is still to organize the revolutionary left, including those who had not called themselves Trotskyists, end quote. In July 1981, the Socialist Organizer Group was joined by the Workers' Socialist League. The Workers' Socialist League was the group which had been formed at first under the name Workers' Revolutionary League by Alan Thornett and his supporters when they had been thrown out of the Heelite Workers' Revolutionary Party late in 1974. In the intervening years, it had been strongly attacked by the Workers' Revolutionary Party, and Workers' Revolutionary Party star, Vanessa Redgrave, had gone so far as to sue Thornett for money she had allegedly, quote, lent and advanced, end quote, to him. The group's relations with some of the other Trotskyist groups, particularly the International Marxist Group, had been more friendly. The Thornett Group remained of significance within British Trotskyism because of its continuing influence among some union groups, particularly in the auto industry. It also was of some importance because it had organized an international grouping, the Trotskyist International Liaison Committee, which, although not one of the larger Fourth International factions, did give it contacts with the World Trotskyist movement, which some of the other British groups no longer had. Therefore, its adherence to Socialist Organizer represented an addition of some consequence. At the time, the Workers' Socialist League joined Socialist Organizer. It apparently merged with the Socialist Organizer. At the time the Workers' Socialist League joined Socialist Organizer, Workers' Socialist League apparently merged within Socialist Organizer with the International Communist League. The Workers' Socialist League gave up its own paper, Socialist Press, quote, and so continued as the only paper of the enlarged organization, end quote. It was agreed that a new theoretical journal would be established to complement the more topical material contained in Socialist Organizer. The Socialist Organizer Group was thus in some ways the most, quote, deep interest, end quote, of all the British Trotskyite factions. Although there remained a frankly Trotskyist organized element within it, in its public presentations it seemed by 1982 to have moved farther than any of the other larger groups from taking a specifically Trotskyist line of analysis or appeal. Get some water. Sorry, something weird in my throat. Kind of feels like a tonsil stone or something. The smaller Trotskyist groups. In addition to the five major elements in British Trotskyism, there continue to exist in the early 1980s several smaller groups with much less influence or membership than the Workers' Revolutionary Party, Socialist Workers' Party, Militants, International Marxist Group SL, and Socialist Organizer. Some note should be taken of these. After late 1975, there existed a small Spartacist element in Great Britain. In that year, the London Spartacist Group was established in London. Then, in February 1978, some 24 members of the Trotskyist faction of Alan Thornett's Workers' Socialist League withdrew from the Workers' Socialist League and soon after joined forces with the London Spartacist Group to establish the Spartacist League/Britain Socialist League SL/B. Quote, as a sympathizing organization of the international Spartacist tendency, end quote. The Spartacist League Britain proclaimed, quote, close on 50 members and a presence both in London and the Midlands, end quote. There is no indication that the Socialist League Britain expanded appreciably after its formation. The Socialist League Britain's generally came to the attention of other Trotskyist groups not so much by its visibility as public demonstrations or in the trade union movement, as by the presence of Spartacist hecklers at the meetings of those other Trotskyist factions. The Spartacists published a monthly periodical which was first called Spartacist Britain, but in 1984 was changed to Workers' Hammer. They were very active in 1984 to 85 in support of the long coal miners' strike. In February 1985, the Spartacists published a special strike supplement of their newspaper which called for railroaders, truck drivers, and dockers to strike in sympathy with the miners. Most of the other fringe Trotskyist groups in Britain had few, if any, overseas contacts. An exception was the Workers' Power Group, originating in a small split in the International Socialists in 1975, which published a monthly newspaper, Workers' Power. Its Irish, quote, fraternal organization, end quote, was the Irish Workers' Group. Of somewhat more significance was the Revolutionary Communist Party. The Revolutionary Communist Party has its origins in the revolutionary opposition within the International Socialists, which was expelled from the International Socialists in 1973. These dissidents first formed the Revolutionary Communist Group, which itself split with the establishment of the Revolutionary Communist Tendency, which ultimately became the Revolutionary Communist Party. What remained of the Revolutionary Communist Group seems to have disappeared. The Revolutionary Communist Party published a monthly review, The Next Step. The May 1982 issue indicated the matters of particular interest to the Revolutionary Communist Party. A note reported that, quote, for the past 2 years, The Next Step has held major conferences in September. The first, attended by more than 200 people, examined various aspects of imperialism around the world. Last year's, twice as big, concentrated on the problems facing the working class in Europe. This year's conference will have a wider focus, taking in developments in the world economy, the labor movement in Britain and abroad, questions of women's oppression and militarism and pacifism, end quote. The Revolutionary Communist Party tended to pay more attention to Britain's racial problems than did most of the other Trotskyist groups. The Revolutionary Communist Party carried the, quote, rank and file, end quote, approach to work and trade unions to an extreme. Its publication's issue of December 1981 wrote that, quote, there is no salvation in trades unionism, end quote, and added that, quote, trade unions organize workers along sectional industrial craft lines. Trade unions reflect the divisions, sectional, sexual, and racial, which capitalism imposes on the labor movement. The unity of our class can only be achieved around objectives which relate not to a particular section, but to the interests of the proletariat as a whole, end quote. When after 1971, the International Committee of the Fourth International split between a group led by the Heliotes on the one hand and one led by the Lambert Group of France on the other, the Lamberts the Lambert group of France on the other, the Lambertists, for some time did not have any representation in Britain. In 1979, such a fraction was formed, the Socialist Labour Group. It consisted principally of people who at different times and for different reasons had broken with Jerry Healey. It was one of the smaller elements in British Trotskyism. Another small group but persistent faction was the Chartist group established in 1970 by Al Richardson, who broke away from the International Marxist group over the issue of its abandonment of entrism in the Labour Party. It was made up of a dozen or more young people in their teens and early 20s. A dozen years later, the Chartist group was still publishing its periodical, Chartist, which on its masthead reported that it was, quote, published 5 times a year by the Chartist Collective, which has supporters in the following areas: Bolton, Brighton, Cambridge, Derby, Leeds, London, Oxford, Liverpool, Preston, Stoke, and Stockport. Chartist is also sponsored by Clause 4, who have 3 subscribers on the editorial collective, end quote. Another very small group that was founded in the early 1960s by the followers of the Argentine leader J. Posadas, the Revolutionary Workers' Party, Trotskyist, it had its headquarters in London and published a periodical entitled Red Flag. The Revolutionary Workers' Party, Trotskyist, was reported in the early 1980s to be still in existence and still publishing its periodical. They were working within the Labour Party. One unfriendly observer credited them with about a dozen members. In spite of being divided into 5 major factions and several minor ones. Several peculiar factors have characterized British Trotskyism. One of these has been the fact that the 2 largest and most important groups are to some degree heretical. The Socialist Workers' Party, rejecting the categorization of the Stalinist regimes as worker states, and the militant tendency, repudiating the basic Fourth International concept of organizing sooner or later an independent revolutionary party outside both the Second and Third International affiliates. A second peculiarity of British Trotskyism has been the fact that throughout its half-century of history it has been faced with the quandary of how to deal with the Labour Party, the organization which the great majority of the country's workers have regarded as, quote, their, end quote, party. During all of this period, the many successive Trotskyist factions have veered from, quote, entrism, end quote, into the Labour Party, into, quote, principled, end quote, opposition to such a maneuver. Neither of these strategies has been obviously successful. Entrism has always involved the dangers of watering down the Trotskyist program and of being absorbed into social democracy and ceasing to be Trotskyist at all. On the other hand, refusal to participate in the Labour Party has involved the risk of more or less complete isolation from the very workers whom the Trotskyists were trying to win over to their cause. That's the last bit on British Trotskyism. So thanks for listening.